In our first reading today about the story of the fall, obviously, where Adam and Eve eat the apple. And I think that when we hear that, or I know certainly when I hear that, I think sometimes what an odd thing that God would ask Adam and Eve to not do, to not eat the apple. Don't eat that. And certainly we see then the devil play on that with his temptation to Eve. Did God really say don't eat the apple? Oh, well, he doesn't really mean that. And I think that it's interesting that a lot of times, maybe if we look at our own Lenten items or actions that we're fasting from, we can be tempted to see or to hear the same thing, to hear the same temptation. If we look at things like television or video games or dessert or pop or caffeine or fasting from, complaining or radio or internet or whatever it is that we're maybe trying to give up for Lent, I think in the same way, at some point during our Lenten fast, the idea will pop into our head that this thing that I've given up is really insignificant. It's very similar to the apple. What does an apple have to do with God? And in the same way, again, the devil will come to us, I think, and say, what are those things that you've given up? What do those have to do with God? What do those have to do with holiness? What would a Coke, why would God care if I had a Coke or not? Or if I played my video games or not? And so, because I hear all the time from many people during Lent, the thing I gave up, I gave in. I gave in and it didn't work. I didn't make it my 40 days. And so I want to reflect on that a little bit, I guess. Why is that? Why is it that God said to Eve, don't eat the apple? Why is it that God encourages us to fast from things? And also to prepare ourselves for the temptation that we will undoubtedly receive, as we already have, probably, the temptation to give up on our Lenten fast. First of all, it's interesting that when we look at the history of fasting from things, up through most of the history of the church, every day of Lent was a fast that was harder than the fast that we now have on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. They did that for 40 days, all during Lent. The early Christians, the Didache, which is the book that follows right after the Acts of the Apostles, it's not in the Bible, but it's considered a document of the church. It was written by the second generation of Christians. Talks about how the Christians back then would fast every Wednesday and every Friday. It's interesting, I think, as well, that when we look at our culture, we are the first culture to eat itself to death. We have so much food that we actually are having health problems and heart failure and all these other things and obesity and so forth from food. We are the first generation to come forward and say that we don't need to fast anymore. Fasting has a long and important tradition in our church, not just from food, but from all other things as well, some of the things that we're giving up for Lent. And lest we trick ourselves and convince ourselves that we don't need to fast from anything, Jesus fasts in the gospel today for 40 days as well, which is why we fast for 40 days in Lent. But if anybody didn't need to fast, it would be Jesus Christ. And yet what does he do? He heads into the desert and doesn't eat basically anything for 40 days. So fasting is not something that we've grown beyond. Is it important to do good things during Lent or when we're fasting? Is it enough to just simply keep the rules? No, we're supposed to, in a spirit of fasting, as we're giving things up, we are also supposed to turn outward toward other people. But we can never get to the point where we've convinced ourselves that we don't need to fast. And so the important thing for us to consider is, why do we fast? What's the importance of that? It seems so trivial, again. It seems like, what does video games or TV or all those things, or what does an apple have to do with my faith? Why do we fast? Why did God ask Adam and Eve to avoid the apple? Well, the reason is that fasting in our life, in our spiritual life, it trains us to do and to behave and to follow God's commandments in ways that we might not otherwise do that. There will be other times in our life where things that God asks of us will not make sense. Where if it was up to me, I would not do that, because a lot of times it doesn't make sense what God's asking me to do right now. There were times in the seminary where I believed if it was up to me, I would have gotten out of there. I would have left. But I knew that God was calling me to that, even though I could not make sense of it. I could not get my arms around it. I didn't know why I was there. We all have that same thought. As parents, as young people, we maybe are in situations sometimes where God's asking something of us and we have no idea why. If we've trained ourselves, if we've denied ourselves things, again, as our early Christian parents, early generations of Christians did that much more frequently, if we have to get into the habit of training ourselves, of not simply doing something because I want to. We have all of these luxuries and this amazing wealth in our country, and Jesus warns against that precisely because it becomes so easy to make myself a god. It becomes so easy to do everything that I want to do. If I want a song, I click on it. If I want to buy that, I click on it. If I want this, I click on it. We do all of those things. We get out of the habit. We get lazy. And it creeps into our spiritual life as well. And so we decide and we put ourselves into the role of God, and we start to tell ourselves, if it doesn't make sense to me, if I can't understand it, then I'm not going to do it. And so we come to the importance of Lent. We come to the importance of fasting from things that won't make sense. There will be a time for you during this Lenten season, maybe many, maybe hundreds, where the thing that you have given up, you will hear in your head a voice telling you, why are you doing that? Who cares? What does the internet have to do with holiness? What does television have? What is candy? What is Coke? What is whatever? We have to realize and recognize that God is encouraging us and asking us to train ourselves, to deny the things that we want, to not make ourselves a god, because when we do, we go crazy and we fall into sin so easily. There comes a time in our life where things that we are asked to do don't make sense to us by God. Now we trust, of course, some religions will say that God will even ask you to do things that are sinful. We know it doesn't go that far. We know that God is only asking us to do things that are holy and that are for our own good. But we have a real trust issue with God sometimes because we can't see it all the time in the moment. We can't see the value of what God is asking of us. If we've trained ourselves, though, it becomes easier to say, I don't understand, but I will do what God is asking. I will do, Lord, what you're asking of me. If we are a people who never fast and who annually give up on our Lenten fast, then we should expect full well that we will also then give up and not do the things that God asks of us in the other areas of our life when it doesn't make sense. We pray for the strength to keep our Lenten conviction and to recognize that it's important. Just as it was extremely important for Eve to not eat the apple, it's extremely important for us to train ourselves as well, so that when bigger decisions and bigger issues come along in our life, we find ourselves having trained ourselves in the practice of saying, Lord, I do not understand, I do not see why you're asking me to do this, but I trust that it's for my own good. And I will do it because I love you.